Hello guys, okay, we'll now move on to chapter 3, which was Hitler's Germany. I'm sure a lot of you need a little bit of a refresher on this topic because it's been so long ago. And also remember that it did come out for the SBQ for the O levels last year, but it could well come out for as part of the SEQs this year. Okay, so essentially this topic is split into two parts. Firstly, the reasons for Hitler's rise to power, and secondly, after he rose to power, what kind of impact did he have? Okay, so firstly, we're going to look at um, reasons for his rise to power, and this can be split into two main parts. So firstly, the weaknesses of the Weimar government, basically the government that preceded Hitler's chancellorship, preceded Hitler's rise to become the Führer. Okay, so we're going to look at this first. Okay, basically this was important because its weaknesses basically set the conditions for a man as radical and as extreme as Hitler to be able to rise to power in a country like Germany. Right, so we're going to look at a few issues with the Weimar government. Okay, basically this is what we looked at last year. So firstly, its structural weaknesses. Okay, the fact that it was a coalition government. Okay, so essentially the parties did not have the majority and therefore they had to form coalitions, basically where more than one party holds the majority of power within a particular government. Okay, so this thing called proportional representation. So basically parties were represented according to how many votes they got, what the percentage of the votes they got during the elections. Okay, so but because of the fact that there were not any clear majorities, coalition governments had to be formed. So when you have two or more parties gathered together to form a majority in order to pass policies, you'll find that there are a lot of disagreements among themselves. Different parties have different ideas. So when you put them together, things like decisions would be decision-making process would definitely be slowed down. Therefore, the coalition governments tended to be quite weak. In fact, that they were weak ensured that people wanted to change them quite regularly, and because there were so many changes in governments, there's so many elections, a lot of these parties and they spent more time trying to win elections rather than to govern. And because there were such frequent changes in the government, you realize that there'll be very, very little done. Because, for example, Party A government A decides to build a highway, for example, and they have 3 years, but 2 years later, an election is held, and this government A gets kicked out. Government B comes in and says that no, I do not want the highway to be built because it's a waste of money, for example. So they stop what government A had done. So essentially, nothing really gets done. Okay, and secondly, like I said, there are a lot of disagreements due to the very different opinions and rivalry among the coalition partners. So this made them even more made the relationships between cooperating parties very, very difficult, and hence the decision-making process would also be very slow, would also be very difficult, and this caused people to lose faith in the coalition government. Okay, so people grew very disillusioned, people lost faith, so they wanted, a change in the government. Okay, and next, there was also a lack of support of the Weimar government. Okay, various groups like the civil service, basically people who used to work for the government when the government was under the German emperor, or remember the Kaiser. Yeah, okay, and also the military were very unhappy with the Weimar government simply because they were the ones who were seen as being responsible for signing the Treaty of Versailles. Wealthy businessmen also preferred a return to the old government because a lot of them were rich, a lot of them and basically benefited from the policies of the old government under the Kaiser, and therefore when the Weimar government came into power, they were all very afraid that its new policies would threaten the kind of prosperity that they had been enjoying thus far. okay, there's also, okay, I'll just keep these open, okay, but just follow me. There was also opposition from the left and the right, okay, in the first few years of the Weimar Republic. Okay, so firstly we had the right wing, which was basically the Kapp putsch, okay, led by very nationalistic military leaders. Okay, they basically were very unhappy with the Weimar government because of the Treaty of Versailles, for example, and they wanted to overthrow the Weimar government. And there was also the left wing, um, the left wing. Okay, so I'm just going to write. The left wing was basically the Spartacists. Okay, if you remember, and the right wing was basically the Kapp putsch. Okay, putsch is basically an attempt to overthrow the government. Okay, so the Spartacists basically they were left wing, and they had very strong communist ideas. Okay, inspired by the Russian Revolution. So they wanted to replace the Weimar government with a communist government to make Germany communist. Okay, and basically they launched their own uprising. They rose against the government, but unfortunately, they were unsuccessful as they were put down by the right-wing military. Okay, so in a way, the fact that the Weimar government could not rely on its own power, but to rely on the right-wing military to suppress this particular uprising, basically caused people to lose faith again in the Weimar government. Okay, so essentially, you just think about all these weaknesses, and a lot of them basically caused people to lose faith in the Weimar government, and therefore want change within Germany itself, and this helped Hitler later on rise to power. Okay, so yeah, like I said, the Freikorps, which was basically part of the right wing, helped to put down the communist revolt. Okay, and yeah, the right wing, the Kapp putsch, was also put down because the workers basically went on strike, and basically they were forced to stop as well. But basically, although these two events, the Kapp putsch and the Spartacist rising, were unsuccessful, what they showed everyone around the world was that the Weimar government was basically built on very unpopular foundations. Okay, it was not very popular at all, and there was an underlying opposition against it. Okay, next, there was also poor decision making. So if you remember, they overprinted money to pay off reparation debts. Remember the reparation clause in the Treaty of Versailles was basically so unreasonable, so harsh that the German government really struggled to pay these debts off. And basically, in order to try to facilitate this repayment, they had to print money. But when you print money, the value of money basically goes down because now there's so much in supply, so the value of money goes down, and therefore this thing called hyperinflation occurred. So for example, in 1 year, a piece of bread could cost maybe 1 mark, but a year later it could cost up to 1,000 marks because basically the currency has become so valueless that you need a lot more of it to buy that very same product. Okay, they also overprinted money because if you remember, what happened was that there was a rule. Basically, the French also remember the French they occupied. Sorry, there's a rural crisis. Okay, so basically, earlier on, when they couldn't pay their debts, the French moved in. They sent their troops into the Ruhr, which was part of Germany, to basically take over the resources over there. So the Germans, the Weimar government, basically told the workers there to go on strike, to stop working, but they still have to pay them, right? They still have to pay them, and therefore, in order to pay them, they also overprinted money. Okay, so they overprinted money for two reasons. Firstly, to pay off the reparation debts, and secondly, to pay striking workers during the Ruhr crisis. And this basically caused this thing called hyperinflation. And because of hyperinflation, many Germans had their savings wiped out overnight. And a lot of people had to spend very, very quickly, okay, in case the prices rise so high the next day that they cannot afford the very same good that they wanted to buy. So basically, again, the Germans suffered a lot because of such a policy. Hyperinflation really caused a lot of people's pension savings to be wiped out, and a lot of people again lost faith in the Weimar government because of all these suffering. Okay, but on the bright side, this guy named Gustav Stresemann, he came into power and then he brought stability and prosperity back to Germany. Okay, a few things he did was to help Germany recover from the effects of hyperinflation. Basically, he replaced the former useless currency with a new currency. Okay, and Stresemann, he came into power in 1923, and what happened was that he replaced this currency uh, with the new currency called the okay, I think I'll write it down. New currency was called the Rentenmark. Okay, so basically this currency was again valuable. Okay, the Rentenmark, and in addition to solving the economic problems of Germany, he helped to improve Germany's relationship with France. Okay, basically through the Locarno Pact, they agreed to define a border between the two countries, and basically this helped to improve relations with France, okay, which was very tense at that time. And then he also got Germany admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. So basically, in admitting Germany into the League of Nations, what happened was that okay, it was a sign that the world had now recognized Germany as an equal player, as one no longer responsible for for the devastation caused by World War One. Okay, and finally he negotiated the Dawes and Young plans with the USA, which basically provided Germany with loans to help to repay their reparations. It also encouraged American investment into Germany, which then created more jobs, more businesses for the German people. Okay, so it allowed Germany more time to pay reparations, and the loans also helped to ease the reparations burdens on Germany. So by doing this, he brought stability and prosperity back to Germany. However, he passed away in 1929, and this was devastating because he was such a capable leader. And when he died, people again began to lose faith in the German government. Okay, and this was not the worst because after he passed away in 1929, what happened was that the Great Depression started. Okay, so what happened during the Great Depression was that the Wall Street in America, Wall Street crashed, and a lot of people in America went bankrupt. They lost jobs, businesses closed down, and because America was in such a bad economic state, it had to withdraw its loans to Germany. Right? I mean, the Americans themselves were in such a bad economic state they couldn't afford to continue to lend Germany money, and they began to ask for money back. Okay, and because of that, the German economy suffered because firstly it needed to repay its loans to Germany, to the USA very quickly. Also, a lot of American investments were pulled out of Germany, so a lot of American companies in Germany had to close down, had to go away, and a lot of Germans had to be retrenched. A lot of Germans had lost their jobs during this period, and the Weimar government unfortunately was unable to take effective action to help Germany out of the depression. So they couldn't stop the decrease in the number of jobs as a result of the Great Depression, and they couldn't keep American investments in as well. Okay, so people really suffered as a result of the Great Depression, and therefore made people lose confidence in the Weimar government. So if you look at the statistics, you realize that just before the Great Depression, um, support for the Nazis was really quite low, was less than 10%. But immediately after the Great Depression happened, and the fact that people were suffering so much, you realize that the Nazis basically took advantage of the situation, and their popularity basically increased many times, okay, after the Great Depression. So the Great Depression caused the Weimar government to lose credibility, and it basically helped people made people focus their attention on alternative parties like the Nazis, right? So Great Depression, loss of a capable leader, poor decision making, which caused hyperinflation, uh, opposition from left and right, which showed that the Weimar government support was not that strong in the very first place. His lack of support as well, okay, which showed that there were early opposition to the Weimar government. And finally, the fact there was a coalition government made the Weimar government structurally very problematic. Okay, so these are the main factors, okay, which basically contributed to the weaknesses of the Weimar government. Alright, and okay, although the Weimar government was weak, Hitler still had some work to do. He had to basically tap on the weaknesses in order to help propel himself to the position of power. So firstly, he was a charismatic speaker, as we all know. So what he did was that he managed to convince many Germans that only Hitler and Nazis understood and could solve Germany's problems. So when he gave his speeches, he liked to talk about how he understood the situation with unemployment, for example. And this made many Germans believe him. And many Germans trusted him as a result, because he looked like he could identify, he could sympathize with the difficulties that they were facing. And the fact that he also spoke, he was a very charismatic speaker, he was a very loud speaker, he spoke, he was a very entertaining, very engaging speaker, basically gave people a lot of confidence in this new leader, okay, which was Hitler. And he also spoke in beer halls, remember? Yeah, and it's where people were more easily influenced, under the influence of alcohol. They would listen to him, and he would be more able to engage them, okay, when they were drunk. Also, he exploited fears of communism. Okay, remember that the communists were the main rivals of the Nazis to take over from the Weimar government. Okay, so Hitler needed to really suppress the communist influences in Germany. So what happened was that he looked at businessmen and farmers. He tried to gain their support. Basically, businessmen were very scared of the communists, because when the communists take over, they would take over German businesses. It will no longer belong to the private businessmen, but to the communist state, like what happened in Russia. Farmers was also scared, because farmers saw what was happening in the Soviet Union, the collectivization policies. So they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. They didn't want the government to take over their land, to force them, to work for the government. They didn't want that. And Hitler basically promised the two groups, the businessmen and farmers, that if he came to power, he would act in their interests. He would help support their interests. Okay, and what happened was that yes, sorry, I said this already. And okay, so for businessmen, what they did was they gave financial support to Nazis. In addition to the votes, they gave Nazis the money to make things like propaganda films. Remember Alfred Hugenberg basically allowed Nazis the access to his studios to make very good propaganda films, which would then influence other German people to vote for the Nazis. Okay, so do you see the link? Okay, he exploited fears of communism and therefore gained more support for the Nazi party itself. And farmers, of course, would later vote for the Nazis. And you must remember that there were a lot of farmers in Germany during this period. So if Hitler were able to appeal to the Nazis, he would be able to get a good share of the vote. Okay, next, the Nazis also used military force to fight the communists. Okay, in particular the SA, or the brown shirts under Rome. Okay, basically the communists, they protested, and they caused some riots during that time. So they looked like they were troublemakers. And by sending the SA in to beat the communists, to put down the communist fights, okay, what happened was that the Nazis basically looked like they were capable of restoring order and stability to Germany, which the Weimar government was unable to do as effectively. So by doing this, basically people again developed this confidence in the Nazi party that they were able to solve both their economic problems and also their political problems, to restore stability to Germany. Okay, and also Hitler was skillful at making deals with politicians. So Hitler was very patient, and he took his time to secure absolute power. Okay, so firstly, he was invited to be chancellor in 1933. Okay, essentially, Hindenburg, who was the president then, saw that the Nazis had about 37% of the German vote, actually. So although that wasn't a majority, it made Hitler you know grow in contention to be chancellor, which is basically prime minister of Germany. Although he was hesitant, certain conservatives like Franz von Papen, if the name sounds familiar to you, okay, so basically von Papen basically convinced President Hindenburg that if Hitler came into power, the conservatives will be able to manipulate Hitler and to use Hitler to also fight the communists within the government itself. So they thought that, oh, it would be a good idea actually to get Hitler there, because we can control Hitler and use him to serve our interests. However, they would be very, very wrong, because Hitler was patient, Hitler took it, and after that we know what happened later on when Hitler became Führer eventually. So although this we'll talk about during the political impact, basically in 1933 there's a Reichstag fire. Basically the parliament building was set on fire, and the blame was placed on the communists, and Hitler used this as an excuse to secure more powers for himself and to win more support in elections, which we'll talk about later on, the Reichstag fire decree. And later on in July 1933, the Nazis became the only legal political party in Germany. So basically his deals with politicians, okay, being able to convince people like von Papen and Hindenburg to elect him chancellor, basically had tremendous repercussions later on. Okay, but remember that he was patient, he waited, and in the end he got his way. Okay, and finally he reorganized the Nazi party. Remember, in 1923 he was sent to prison. That's where he wrote Mein Kampf, because of a failed he failed to overthrow the government. And during this time, he became convinced of the need to win elections, because basically when he tried to overthrow the Weimar government in 1923, he realized that people didn't rally to his side. People did not support Hitler, and the Nazis naturally. So when he was in prison, he realized that, hey, we actually need true popular support in order to overthrow the Weimar government. Okay, and what he did was to did a few things. First, he established local branches of the Nazi party all over Germany. Okay, which basically increased people's exposure to the Nazi party, and when more people knew about the Nazi party and knew what the Nazi party stood for, they were more likely to vote for Hitler and to support Hitler, which helped him in his rise to power. He also set up many Nazi youth organizations, basically appealing to the young people. And the young people, of course, are very easily influenced. And when you can influence the young people, when they grow older and when they grow to become of voting age, they will be able to then support you later on. And he also set up the SA, remember the brown shirts, and the SS under Himmler. These military organizations basically gave the Nazis a tough image. Nazis looked like they were able to restore order, looked like a very, very strong party, which could make Germany strong again. And finally, propaganda was used to portray the Nazis as a strong party, and a party that was capable and united behind one leader, one very, very strong leader, who was Hitler himself. And this helped to basically develop in people a confidence in the Nazis. The Nazis were new, but because of propaganda, because of the fact they were able to portray themselves as a very tough party, gave people the confidence and to vote for Hitler, to support Hitler in his rise to power. Okay, so essentially when you look at all these factors, it's not enough just to know what they're about, but you make sure that you're able to link these factors. The fact that he was a charismatic speaker, that he exploited fears of communism, that he was skillful at making deals with politicians, and that he reorganized the Nazi party. Ensure that you're able to link all of these very clearly to how Hitler eventually rose to power. Okay, so think about how they gained support for Hitler and how they made people want to vote for Hitler, made people want to support Hitler. Alright? Okay,